Thanks very much, Sarah. Good morning, and we're delighted to be the main sponsor for this event. I'm just going to quickly go through an explanation of who Scottish European Green Energy Centre is and what we get up to. Also, I'm going to touch on a couple of the issues that have already been identified, but I hope not to labour them so we can get on to the Q&A relatively quickly. So who is Scottish European Green Energy Centre? We're a very young organisation. We were actually only incorporated last year. We're actually a public-private partnership, not-for-profit, and we're also supported by the ERDF. We've actually got some pretty interesting strategic aims in that we only have to help Europe achieve its 2020 and 2050 targets, so nothing too difficult there then. You can see that basically we do this in a number of ways. We do it by focusing on certain activities, influencing issues where there's barriers and trying to facilitate developments and real projects. Large-scale demonstration deployment is what we're all about. Just as important is actually, once we've done that, actually disseminating those results and giving people an idea of how we did things and how it can be replicated. The priority areas that we've been given, this is not an exhaustive list, and again, it's extremely easy with 8 people, so fairly achievable. But you'll see that there's all the usual suspects are there in terms of topics. I won't go through them all, but what I would say is that the one at the bottom actually is not just a lobbying aspect. So how do we actually make these things happen? Well, you've heard all around the theoretical aspects of putting policies in place and actually ensuring that everything's okay in terms of providing the right frameworks. Often that's not enough. Actually getting some finance to do some of the projects, actually leveraging finance, and actually getting the right collaborative partners together is a real challenge. And quite often we find that they don't actually come together by themselves. There's a strange activity in market forces which actually prevents the best collaborations coming together often. And that's where CJEC actually comes in, and we facilitate that area. So in terms of our first test that we had, we were actually given a fairly interesting first test in that the economic recovery package from Europe suddenly came out 8 weeks into our incorporation. And we, on behalf of the UK, because the UK didn't have any oven-ready projects to go forward, actually put 3 projects forward. One was an offshore wind farm, or offshore wind development centre, should I say. One was an innovative supergrid node off of Caithness, and the other was a carbon capture and storage project. And as you can see, we were pretty successful in leveraging just over 100 million euros of public funding out of the European Commission, which in turn leveraged another 300 million of private investment. So in our first year, we've been pretty successful at actually delivering on some of the promises that we've put forward in terms of what we've been tasked to do. If you want to know more, I suggest that you stay seated because there's a masterclass just after this plenary session of which we'll give you some more information around that activity. I'm just going to look at some of the key aspects that I think you, the audience, actually are being given. And I'm not certain that it's really come home how much of an opportunity this really is. Challenging times, yes, in public spending, but actually the opportunity that you have is quite enormous. from a local perspective. In the coalition agreement, we got a flavour of the activities that were identified. Energy specifically was very heavily identified for the local treatment. Just a couple of points that I'd like to highlight, that actually the order of projects is absolutely key with regards to some of the setup that's being looked at. You heard earlier about a number of councils actually being prevented from actually implementing projects because their grid wasn't sufficient. Well, actually, there's a whole range of aspects around smart grids, and again, I'll mention more of this in the masterclass, but actually smart grids can provide a huge opportunity to actually provide the support that's required to deliver a lot of the renewable generation that we've been talking about. And quite often, smart grids, or grids in themselves, are actually forgotten about. And I'll take issue with one of the speakers in that actually it's not the national grid we need to think about so much as the distribution grid. And the distribution grid is actually your locality. And that's where some real activity can be achieved. And as Vice Chair of the European Technology Platform for Smart Grids, I have a really keen interest in making sure smart grids actually happens. Moving on, the coalition agreement has re-identified continually the issues around the local activity. There's something called the European Industrial Initiatives, which are being launched, were launched in June, in fact. And Smart Cities is going to be a European Industrial Initiative, which is going to be delivered. And I'll talk a little more on that in a few seconds. But Smart Cities actually is about a systemic approach to delivery. Smart Cities actually provides the solutions to some of the problems that we've got in terms of the constraints from a national perspective. Quite often, it's easier to do things in a small way in a city than it is on a national scale from that perspective. Again, in the masterclass, I'll go into this in more detail. The spending review certainly reiterated, I think, the actual key deliverables that were identified in the coalition agreement, which are that there are no compromises. National is being transferred to local decision making, and it's up to you to make the best of what you have. Now, this is a real opportunity. Again, I come back to this because actually, quite often, it's all the reasons why we can't do things. Constraints on public spending, constraints on planning. Well, actually, the opportunities far outweigh the constraints. Just with regards to the sorts of money that are being ploughed into this, you will not find another area in the government spending which has got such focused spending plans at present. And that's another key aspect. Yesterday, as has already been identified, the National Infrastructure Plan identified again that local is good. And that's interesting in a National Infrastructure Plan because, again, it's actually putting a lot of emphasis on what the national infrastructure is required, but who's going to do the delivery? The local aspect again. Certainly from the ports aspect, it's really good news from the fact that there's no reduction in that activity as well. The local growth white paper that was identified earlier, I think, is a key opportunity. And again, this is an opportunity for influencing this. It's not out. There are opportunities to actually get into that paper some key aspects that will be allowing barriers to be removed. None of this is going to happen, by the way, without private investment. And following yesterday's announcement about the wind turbine generators, I was with the pension groups earlier in the month, and they are keen and ready and willing. The problem is that there's no definition in terms of the return on investment for many of these things in long-term return on investment.